So welcome to you all. Welcome back after 1 week. Thank you for being here. So wait, I still have to. Okay, so thanks again. Sorry for this start. So I will now start the second class. So as you remember last time, I was presenting the similarities between Vladimir Assad and Bashar Putin, focusing on three angles, three dimensions: the fact that they both inherited their power, the fact that they are both coming from the intelligence underworld, and the fact that they are both running a mafia-like system. Is there any question about that now that you thought about it? Would you like to address something that you're not sure you understood last time? Is it clear, fine? Any question, clarification? Either if you're
I have a question.
Yes, please do.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask about ideological aspect of these regimes because I personally, and I think the most part of our group, understand the ideological changes of Vladimir Putin regime, but I don't know how the situation with Assad regimes, how ideology is important in this regime, and if it has changed through the time with regime dynamics.
So that's a very important question. You know, what I tried to explain last week is that no matter how much those regimes speaks about ideology, in fact, they are run by a dictatorial, mafia-like dynamics that has very little to do with ideology. I don't think Putin is even more communist than Assad is a Ba'athist. What is important is they are defending a system at any cost, because for them, it's, as I tried to explain, it's a Darwinian logic. For them, it's kill and not being killed. So they can have parties, they can have meetings, they can have Congress. By the way, they have less and less party and meeting and Congress, and more war and repression and killing. And I think that is the key. No matter how much they try to portray themselves as ideology driven. Is that correct? Is that fine with you?
Yes, but maybe you can say about aspect. For example, Putin has changed from in the start of his reign, he was like a Western-orientated politician. He was talking about some that liberal democracy is okay, but then they came to the concept of sovereign democracy, and then to the concept of Russian world, and now it is core of his ideology is that his rule should be authoritarian and clearly opposite to the Western world. Does Bashar Assad regime had such dynamic from the cooperation with Western world to the clear opposition?
Again, this is my interpretation. No matter what is their political discourse, their only obsession is clinging to absolute power. So at the beginning also, Bashar al-Assad was presented as a reformer, somebody who was opening Syria to the West and Europe. The reality was that he was just changing, upgrading the way his father system was already plundering the country. And you can say that with Putin. Putin in the beginning, he played his cards pretty well. He used a lot the global war on terror by saying that I'm also, part of this world front against a global threat that is terrorism. But we all saw in Chechnya and in other places that it was all pretense, that in fact he was what we can call a pyromaniac bomber that is fueling the flames that is pretending to stop. And so in my field of work, I try to focus on what regimes and political leaders are doing more than on what they pretend to defend. And very often you learn a lot from this kind of regime by observing the way they work. And the way Putin or Bashar al-Assad work didn't change dramatically since they came to power. They have been always anxious for keeping this absolute power into their only hands. Is that fine with you?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question here in the room or online before I start today's lecture? No, it's fine. So today I will speak about the SYRIAN laboratory. As you saw in the syllabus I sent you, you could have with English subtitles a French documentary on the Arte French-German TV station that is very eloquent with vivid images proving how this SYRIAN laboratory works. In fact, a laboratory for the ongoing aggression against Ukraine. So first, before we start, just a small recap about chronology, about what happened in Syria since 2011. In 2011, there was a peaceful democratic uprising against the dictatorship that Bashar al-Assad inherited from his father Hafez in 1970. It was peaceful, but it was immediately met with a ruthless repression. The peaceful demonstrators, even the demonstrators that were going out with their shirts open to prove that they didn't want to conceal any weapons, were shot on sight. Why? Because for this kind of regime, the first concession is the last concession. They know only absolute monopoly of power. But because also Bashar al-Assad was from day one unconditionally supported on his repressive stand by both Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin and, as we will see next week, by the Islamic Republic of Iran. So even though Russia was not directly involved in Syria until 2015, in fact, they were present everywhere in the country by supporting the repression. And anything that was killing Syrian civilians in this country during those years was Russian-made. The bullets, the rockets, the missiles, the tanks, the planes, everything was Russian-made. And everything was airlifted by Russia on a regular basis in the airports in Syria or in the ports where it was brought by sea from day one. And there was from day one Russian advisors, military advisors that were, counseling the repression and giving technical advices, and which is why I chose to give this title to this class about the SYRIAN laboratory, because they were testing techniques that now have been spreading so much destruction in Ukraine. So 2011. In 2012, the revolutionary forces, thanks to the support of the West, managed to take control, in their own words, to liberate the suburbs of Damascus and half of Aleppo city, the two main cities of Syria. And by the way, the two oldest cities of humanity that have been inhabited for probably 8,000 years continuously. But because of a decision by Barack Obama, by the White House, they didn't get the weaponry that would have been significant enough to topple the regime. They didn't get anti-aircraft defense, they didn't get artillery, and of course they didn't get planes. So that means that the regime, despite this push by the revolutionary forces, had the monopoly on the tanks, on the artillery, and on the plane. And I could experience that when I was infiltrated in revolutionary held areas in Aleppo. That meant that you were absolutely vulnerable to air attacks, and helicopters could fly very low and drop what they call barrel bombs, which were in fact a very rudimentary mix of metal scraps and TNT explosive that had the maximum destructive impact on the civilian targets. And they were just dropped randomly. In 2013, in order for the regime to regain control of the revolutionary suburbs of Damascus, he dropped gas shells on the suburb of Damascus in August 2013, killing some 1,400 people, 2/3 of them by gas, and the others by classical shells that had been used during this shelling in order to, as we will see, to obscure the truth of the use of gas bombs against civilian targets. And despite that, despite the fact that Barack Obama had claimed that he would defend red lines, that the use of chemical weapons would be considered as a red line that he would try to enforce, he eventually decided to back down, and instead of punishing Bashar al-Assad, decided to negotiate with Vladimir Putin a sham agreement on the dismantlement of the chemical arsenal. In fact, Bashar al-Assad never dismantled those weaponries, and he has been using them for years repeatedly. From my point of view, and I'm not the only one thinking that, this back down of Barack Obama convinced Vladimir Putin that he could move on against Ukraine by occupying and then annexing Crimea. 6 months later, only 6 months later. By Vladimir Putin standard time, 6 months is a small period of time, just in order to bring his mind together. And in 2015, Putin decided to intervene directly, this time in Syria, under the pretense of defending, as you mentioned, the sovereignty of the regime against the so-called revolutionary forces. If you just mind 1 second, I will close the door. This is live recording. So, since 2015, Russia is de facto an occupying power in Syria. I insist on that, because in Ukraine, you know perfectly all this discourse about the Kremlin, about sovereignty. How, you know, it's the Orwellian world of Putin. When he says something, it means the contrary. So by pretending he is defending the sovereignty of Syria, he de facto became an occupying power in Syria under the pretense of supporting Bashar al-Assad against his own people. So from that day on, the techniques of terror, the techniques of war, and I will go through that during this lecture, have been systematically tested. And most of them, in fact, I think all of them, have been replicated against Ukraine since 2022. And the parallel between the siege of Aleppo in 2016 and the siege of Mariupol last year in Ukraine is really striking. This is, as we will see, the same terror techniques that have been used in both instances. In 2018, Russia pretended it had settled what it called reconciliation agreement. Again, that's the Orwellian word. Reconciliation means total surrender. Peace means total acceptation of the ruler's condition. There's absolutely no negotiation. No? So that was just a chronology, very quickly. No? But my interpretation, and this is what will try to present today, is that the Middle East as a whole is a power generator. That no power in this world could be a power without being a power in the Middle East. And in fact, Putin enjoyed historical opportunity with the withdrawal of the American power from the Middle East during the last decade, and the fact that there was a vacuum that Putin occupied from Syria. And this power he generated from the Middle East is now being used against Ukraine. Is that clear? This is my interpretation. Of course, like all interpretation, it's debatable. I put everything on the table, but I will try to explain. So today's presentation, like last week's presentation, is articulated into three parts. The first part will be about paralyzing the United Nations. The second part will be about the terror tactics. And the third part will be targeting the truth. Because as we see in Ukraine, the truth is a priority target of Russia, or to say more correctly, of Putin's regime when trying to achieve its military goals, which are global goals. Military is only a way to achieve this global power outside and this absolute power inside that is at the very core of Putin's regime and, by the way, Bashar al-Assad regime. So first about paralyzing the United Nations. And again, you see, I will not stress it each time, but the parallel with the Ukraine crisis is really striking. So again, inside this part, I will divide it in three subparts. The first one about the veto at the Security Council, the second one about the Chinese and Global South complacency, and the fourth one about the third one about crimes without criminals. So at the Security Council, Russia used the full extent of its veto power since 2011. It has opposed its veto to UN Security Council resolution 17 times, de facto paralyzing the United Nations system, because you have to understand that beside those 17 vetoes, you have all the times when the Western democracy and the rest of the world watered down their draft resolution at the Security Council in order to avoid the Russian veto. And usually they do it in a very sadistic way. That they bring the rest of the world, the whole diplomats, the whole well-meaning diplomats want to achieve a resolution, and they try and they make draft and they water it down, and ultimately the Russian put their veto. So it's an humiliation topping a whole series of useless concessions. The fact that Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, has been the UN Special Representative of Russia for 10 years before becoming minister, since 1994 to 2004, of course, give him an intimate experience about what is the UN Security Council. So instead of being, an institution where the international community could achieve a consensus to prevent war and achieve peace, it became exactly the contrary. It became a blackmailing machine by Russia against the rest of the world. So in the beginning, it was to avoid any kind of condemnation of the Assad regime by the rest of the world. And then it became a way at the Security Council to prove that Russia could get the last word on every international initiative and to counter any opposition to its own policy. I will give a more recent example, and we will see it now with the catastrophe of the earthquake in southern Turkey and in northern Syria. You have the question of the cross-border international aid. It's crucial because many areas, even today, despite the Russian involvement in Syria, are out of government control. So that means that cross-border aid is essential in order to access those populations, and the other one at this very moment who are the victims of the catastrophe. But Russia repeatedly opposed its veto to the different cross-border initiatives that were put on the table. So it's not only the support of the Assad regime, it's also just to say, look, we are ruling the game, and you have to play by our own standards. And there is nothing called the international community. It's Russia first and only, and we set the rules, and you have to stick by it. And a lot of UN agencies have de facto accepted it because they are operating from Damascus, and in Damascus, it's like being totally under the control of the Assad regime and now also of Russia. So that means that they have accepted that they are losing this margin of maneuver, this independence, this neutrality to, in fact, this Russian diktat. The second thing is that at the UN, during the Syrian crisis, during now more than 12 years, you had this UN became a laboratory by Russia to reach out for Chinese complacency. Because the Chinese, most of the time, they vetoed the same resolution that the Russian vetoed. So it was not just Russian veto. The Chinese joined their position, but they also tried to nurture the impression, which is an illusion, that it was a Western issue, that it was the West against the rest of the world. Again, the parallel with Ukraine is pretty obvious, with the idea that the global South should be more understanding of what Russia wanted to achieve in Syria. How did they just achieve that? They achieved that by nurturing a narrative that it's a new Cold War. It's a new Cold War. That the West is supporting the opposition in Syria because they want to topple a pro-Russian regime. The reality, as we saw in 2013 with Obama's backing down on his own red line, as we saw before with the same Obama refusing to give strategic weaponry to the Syrian guerrilla, in fact, it was a one-sided Cold War. The only one that was fighting a Cold War was Putin. But he could pretend to, first, his own constituency in Russia, second, to the rest of the global South, that he was under attack by America and its allies, and that he was only reacting. And then you had the whole narrative about defending the sovereignty of the regime against so-called revolution, might be color revolution in Ukraine, it might be popular uprising in Syria, and that in fact the regime, the sovereignty of the regime should be the nec plus ultra of international law. And we all know that it's a very biased conception of international law. And Syria became the laboratory for this kind of misconception. And by the way, through that, Vladimir Putin managed to become very popular among various Middle Eastern autocrats, even rulers that were supposed to be pro-West. And he started to tell them, look at Obama. He abandoned Hosni Mubarak in Egypt in front of the so-called Arab Spring in February 2011. Me, Vladimir Putin, I stick to my friends, I stick to Bashar al-Assad, and I will support him all the way. And of course, this kind of speech, when it comes to rulers in the Arab world, became quite popular. And Putin, thanks to that, developed networks all over the region, far beyond the usual pro-Russian areas. So he managed to do that at the UN because until today, and this is one of the really scandals of international what has been achieved by the international community about Syria, it is Bashar al-Assad and his regime that is representing Syria at the UN. So that means that when you're debating war crimes in Syria, when you're debating humanitarian catastrophe, when you're debating cross-border aid, the person representing Syria is representing Assad's regime. So he's representing exactly the party that is inflicting those pains to the Syrian people. So it's like asking the criminal to defend the innocent. And of course, it will never happen. And of course, Syria is now reciprocating by supporting all the way Russia on the Ukrainian file, voting all, opposing all the resolution that Russia wanted to oppose. So they tried to bypass this blockade at the Security Council through the General Assembly, the same way it went on with Ukraine. But Syria, and as we'll see in the next class, Iran, have been very coherent in their sticking to the Russian line. The third very disturbing dimension of this paralysis of the United Nations is the crimes without criminals. After nearly a year into the Syrian crisis, the Syrian revolution, there was an Arab peace plan that was blocked by a veto, by a Russian veto at the Security Council, that was endorsed by the UN General Assembly in March 2012, and the former Security General Kofi Annan, Peace Nobel Prize, was mandated as the special envoy of the United Nations and of the Arab League to enforce this peace initiative in Syria. But the first thing Kofi Annan did was to go to Damascus and meet Bashar al-Assad to seek his approval for his peace plan. So that just brings us back to how can you expect Bashar al-Assad to shoot himself in his own foot? It's impossible. So of course, Bashar al-Assad he just managed to neutralize this peace initiative. And there was an observer mission by the United Nations that was sent to Syria. And this observer mission each time asked the permission of the Assad representative in this or that part of the country before observing what was going on. So they were really tying themselves through this formal respect of the formal Syrian sovereignty that was in fact only the arbitrary diktat of the regime. And in May 2012, there was a massacre in central Syria in a village called Al-Hula, near the city of Homs. More than 100 people killed, half of them children. It was very clear that it was the equivalent of the thugs that we discussed last, the Titushki, they call it Shabiha in Syria. It was very clear that they were the one responsible for the massacre. But instead of going immediately through it to gather the proofs of the crimes, the United Nations observers waited for the approval of the local governor. And of course, the moment they arrived on the scene of the crime, the proofs had disappeared. So that when the United Nations, involuntarily, but unfortunately, invented crimes without criminals. So you come, you see, oh, we have so many people who have been killed, oh, it's horrible, it's a disaster, we count the dead, we have so many bodies, we can say that they have been killed with this kind of weapons, but we will never say who is responsible. Yeah? So we'll see in my last point that this kind of crime without criminal alternative reality can only feed fake news and conspiracy theories. Because if even the United Nations cannot say clearly, those are the responsible, those are the guilty ones, this is the Assad regime, and this is the local Shabiha or gangster or Titushki, then it's impossible for people to believe in the very truth of the repression, the oppression, and the various crimes that were committed. So that's how the UN went into that. And it was even worse after the chemical attacks of August 2013, because Russia threatened to veto the resolution at the Security Council and managed to delay the sending of an international investigation commission for many days, which means that the more you wait, of course, the more the proofs can be destroyed or just physically disappear. And in the mandate of the commission, they were forbidden to say who was responsible of the firing. So Russia could say, look, there is a United Nations investigation committee, and they said that it was not the Assad regime. They didn't say it was not the Assad regime. They just didn't say who was responsible because their mandate forbids them to do so. And the Assad regime, despite the fact that he was supposed to dismantle his chemical arsenal through an agreement between Lavrov and his US counterpart, John Kerry, under the auspices of both Presidents Putin and Obama, the Assad regime, he went on using chemical weapons for many years. But imagine, there was, for example, a chemical attack in 2018. It's only recently, which means more than 4 years later, that the UN body confirmed that the Assad regime had used chemical weapons on that day. It's in a place called Khan Sheikhoun in Syria. So how can you convince the world opinion? How can you convince the global citizen that there is international justice when this delay is so long in order to be finally conclusive. So this is this paralyzing of the UN that has been tested by Russia in Syria, and that is now threatening again to be used in Ukraine. But fortunately, the world has learned a little of those lessons in order to avoid the repetition of such tragic episode. So that was my first part about paralyzing the UN. Would you have any questions, comments? Please, Platon.
You mentioned several times like chemical weapons that were used, and you said about the West and the global South. We all know that US trained rebels to fight, and in 2018 Trump ordered to strike missiles on the airports of Assad regime. I would like to answer what was the reaction of some European countries or maybe the EU as one of the global powers to chemical weapons?
Well, it's a very important question. First, about the question of training. You know, the idea that US officer can train a Syrian guerrilla to fight guerrilla warfare in Syria, I find it very strange. You know, as one US general confided to me, the Syrian guerrillas, they know the terrain, they drink the water, they eat the food, they speak the language, and they know why they fight. All this is something we cannot train them to. So the problem is more with a classical army, it can be US Army or European Army, having a problem with the guerrilla. They don't know. It is a different way to fight a war. So, in fact, most of the people who were, quote unquote, trained by the Americans, they never actually fought in Syria. Because the ones who were fighting in Syria, they were there and they were busy fighting in Syria. They couldn't go outside to be trained. What they wanted is weapons. And the weapons, the critical weapons, were never delivered. Anti-aircraft, artillery, and so on and so forth. The second thing is that when Obama decided to back down on his own red lines, France President François Hollande was ready to go. And he was very shocked that Obama just let him down like that after talking with Putin and without even consulting him. But France technically could have gone on its own. And I insist, the fight was not going on with a long-term offensive against Assad, but just strike him to make him understand that he cannot go unpunished. And France could not do that because of its mandatory legacy in Syria. It would have been immediately accused of neo-colonial aggression and so on and so forth. So it was politically that the France and Europe in general could not go as far as what was expected. Trump in 2017, he struck once an air base that had been used by Bashar al-Assad for chemical attack. But I don't want to go into details, but the Americans before the raid informed the Russians. So the Russians informed the Syrians. There was nobody at the base. There was only two poor people that were not informed. So it was purely symbolic. It was just to say, oh, this time we're going to show our teeth, but there was no teeth shown. Okay. Have I answered your question? Other question? Please, please.
You mentioned the fact that the people who the people represent countries like Syria and
United Nations.
United Nations, they only represent the criminal regimes.
Yes.
So, do you think those countries will have like authoritarian regimes should be banned on the United Nations, or we should find some other ways to represent the people of those nations?
Well, that's an existential debate, and I'm not going to have a final answer on that. I can only answer about Syria. What is sure is that in Syria there was an alternative. There was a so-called Syrian National Council at that time, but that the West didn't want to give it international recognition. So the Syrian revolutionary forces were caught in a diplomatic limbo. There were people, there were an international gathering called the Friends of Syria, but it was not the Syria that was sitting at the United Nations, because the same Friends of Syria didn't grant international recognition to the alternative council. So they were caught in the middle. And in fact, that was a significant vulnerability of the Syrian opposition, because anybody that would flee the Assad regime would go nowhere internationally. There was no international body that was representing it on a legal basis. It could be a political basis, it could be a Friends of Syria basis, but it was lacking this international recognition. That's why I answer only about Syria. Okay? So now I move to a very depressive dimension of this, which is the terror tactics. And the terror tactics that you know all too well in Ukraine now, have all of them been tested and developed in Syria. I will speak about the three dimensions. First one, bomb and expel. The second one, the so-called humanitarian corridors that are nothing short of humanitarians. And the third one, the irregulars and extremists that are absolutely not irregular, but are very useful. So the bomb and expel technique is, in fact, a strategy. It's systematic. We're not talking about collateral damages. When a country like Russia, indirectly before 2015, directly after that in Syria, and now in Ukraine, is systematically bombing bridges, roads, schools, hospitals, it's not collateral damage. It's a strategy. And this strategy is aiming at frightening the population in order for the population to flee. So you know that approximately 1/4 of the population of Ukraine has been displaced and has been forced to seek refuge since the beginning of the war, which was in fact far more brutal than in Syria. In Syria, to reach that proportion of the population displaced or forced to take refuge, it took many years, while it took only a few weeks here in Ukraine, which proves that the terror tactics have been really developed from the Syrian theater to the Ukraine theater. But the difference, fortunately, in Ukraine compared to Syria is that in Ukraine it's reversible. People crossing in and out. Of course, it's easy or comfortable. It's a tragedy, but it's reversible. While in Syria, you have now half of the population that have been forced out of their home since the beginning of the conflict in 2011. Half of them are displaced inside Syria. Half of them are expelled out of Syria and now are refugees, mostly in the Middle East, in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and a significant part of them in Europe, mainly in Germany, that has been the most generous country welcoming Syrian refugees. So what is important to understand that Russia developed this terror strategy systematically, and that when it started to intervene directly in Syria, it only made it worse. In Aleppo, during the siege of Aleppo in 2016, the only hospitals that were not bombed by the Russians were the one who had not given their GPS data to the UN, which means that the UN, providing the data to the Russian in order to avoid the bombing, in fact, helped the bombing by the Russian or by Russian control forces. That means exactly the contrary of anything that humanitarian law stands for. And it was even worse, if I might say, during the same siege of Aleppo in 2016, there was a humanitarian convoy of the UN that was bombed. Everybody knew that all pointed to the Russian responsibility, and nothing was done because Russia had the veto power at the UN. So it was really a vicious circle, and everything in the international law that was supposed to protect the victim was used by the killers to strike even more at the victims. And that was really the core dynamics of those Russian terror strategy in Syria. And in fact, in Syria, they went further, because despite all the speech about we are going to rebuild Syria and all that, they did nothing about it, because they are pretty happy, and of course the Assad regime is even happier, to leave all part of the country destroyed in order to avoid the return of the refugee, because they know that a significant part of the refugees would still want their freedom. And they don't want this kind of people to return to Syria. They prefer to have them out of the country. So it's like the famous saying about the guerrilla should be like a fish in the water. So very systematically, the Russians want to empty the water in order to kill the fish, except the water is people. So they are ready to go all the way to kill or expel the people in order to defeat their enemies. The second dimension is the so-called humanitarian corridors. As we will see in the third part, you have this Orwellian dimension of the Russian propaganda. When they say something, they mean exactly the contrary. So the corridors, it's not a corridor and it's not humanitarian. It's a trap. What they wanted to do in Aleppo in 2016, what they wanted to do in Mariupol in 2022, is to turn the population against the defenders of the city by saying, look, if you are trapped, it's not because we are bombing you, starving you, besieging you, it's because those people are preventing you to leave the city. So they open a so-called corridors that become a trap where people are being bombed, starved, and besieged. You know that all too well. There was before that another occurrence, which was the Palestinian camp that was supposed to be under UN protection. It's called Yarmouk, in the suburbs of Damascus. And despite this UN legitimacy, the camp was besieged and starved during 3 years. And the rough estimate is that hundreds of people died, 2/3 of them from starvation. We're talking about the 21st century. Nobody would have even nightmare that people would be starved to death in a supposedly UN protected area of Syria. And the UN had to negotiate with the killers and ultimately with the Russians the possibility for humanitarian convoys to enter the camp. And I reported at that time that, for example, the food was, most of the food was banned for the convoy, but you had shampoo and anti-lice products. It's really so shocking. The third thing is, of course, about the so-called irregulars and extremists. In Syria, like in Ukraine, Russia and the Putin regime needs those so-called irregulars in order to cover its own crimes. It needed the Titushki against Euromaidan, it needed those thugs, it needed Wagner, the Wagner society of mercenaries, it needed the Kadyrovtsi of Ramzan Kadyrov from Chechnya. All those people, they are the useful extremists. Look, those people are irregulars. Those people are not under our control. Those people are really running wild. If you let us play, if you let us rule the area, maybe we could just bring those people under control. Now, this is, good cop, bad cop, very standard policy, but it has been used repeatedly. And one of the strengths, I may say, of the Putin's terror strategy is that it is pretty simple, but it has been repeated so many times with so much success that they don't need to make it more sophisticated. They just go on with the same kind of terror strategy, and unfortunately, it works many times. So, as I presented you in the last lecture, this is also linked to the very mafia-like nature of Assad and Putin's regime. You have criminal networks that you can rely on. You have people who will do the worst thing for money or for getting a blank check into plundering, raping, and all those mass crimes. And then you can say, oh, it was not the regular army. It was people who were totally out of control. So in Syria, Syria was a laboratory for this kind of terror techniques, but it was also where the generals who are now heading the Russian so-called military, special military operation, in fact, full-scale invasion against Ukraine, this is where they got their practical battlefield experience of working together with those irregulars, with the Wagner and with Kadyrovtsi. Most of the generals who have been bombing and attacking Ukraine, they have this Syrian background and pedigree. It's Dvornikov, who was heading the Russian forces against your country last spring, was nicknamed Syria's butcher, just to give you an indication of how popular he was over there. While General Surovikin, nicknamed Armageddon General, was famous or infamous for the war crimes that were committed in Khan Sheikhoun in 2019. So you see that Syria became a laboratory for Putin's Russia for combined and eventually total warfare against any kind of opposition to the oppression. So I know it's a little bit disturbing, but I had to go through all that. Do you have questions, clarifications, comments about what I just presented? Please. Well, you know, at the very beginning of the Russian invasion of your country, the Syrian freedom activists, the human rights defenders, stood immediately and publicly with Ukraine against Russia. They organized demonstration in opposition-run part of Syria with the Ukrainian flag, but they said also very clearly two things. They say, don't leave your country, because that's exactly what Putin wants you to do, and that's what Putin did to us. He forced us to leave our country. And they also said, the doctor, they say, protect your hospitals. No, don't pretend that putting a red cross on an hospital will be enough. Put a sandbag, put everything you can. If you can bring the operation block into the basement, do it, because the Russian won't stop at anything. Does that answer your question? Is it, well, again, that's a very important debate, and I can just comment on the Syrian dimension. Ukraine, your country, your people had the privilege to have a state, a functional state, whose president immediately decided, with the support of the whole population, to resist. As I told you before, the Syrian people, they were left in a limbo. They had no official leader. They were not officially recognized internationally. Today's President Zelensky is in London. Tomorrow he will be in Brussels. The Syrian opposition, they were, you know, going from one capital city to the other, waiting for the friends of Syria to deliver some kind of help, military or humanitarian, but they didn't have the recognition, the legitimacy. I think that's the main difference. And my Syrian friends at the beginning of the Russian all-out invasion, they say, of course we stand with Ukraine, but the Ukrainians, they have a state defending them. We are the regime terrorizing us. That is, I think, the main difference. Okay. So now I move to the last and third point, which is targeting the truth. And as you see, since you paralyze the UN, since you use systematically those terror techniques, you have also to develop a narrative to whitewash those war crimes. So the narrative is not a plus. The narrative is at the very core of this aggression. And again, in the 3 points, you know, the fact that you dehumanize the other, the fact that you're systematically killing journalists, and the fact that you have literally a fake news industry. So remember the last lecture, when I try to describe the intelligence underworld culture that Putin and Assad were coming from. They are living in an alternative reality. And for them, any threat is an existential threat, and any threat is to be crushed absolutely. And in order to crush and liquidate this threat, they have to dehumanize it. They have to describe any kind of opposition in Syria as terrorist, and they have to describe any kind of Ukrainian resistance as neo-Nazi. That is the same, and they will repeat it, they will hammer it. From day one in Syria with the Assad regime, from day one against Ukraine with Putin and his propaganda. And they celebrate the so-called Victory Day. So with so many victories, one could expect that they eventually achieve victory, but they never achieve victory. The victory is an ongoing process, in fact, just engineered to liquidate this kind of opposition. And when you're talking about terrorism in Syria, of course there were terrorists in Syria. You had the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh in Arabic. And in 2015, when the Russians moved in directly, they pretended that they were fighting terrorism, that they were fighting Islamic State. But the reality was that the only people that were fighting the Islamic State, and they had been fighting it already for 1 year, were the Americans, the French, and the British, both in Syria and in Iraq, where they were fighting the so-called caliphate, in fact, a terror caliphate that was a totalitarian apparatus really oppressing the Syrian and the Iraqi people before exporting its own terror in Europe, in France, and in other places, countries, and continents. Most of the war against the so-called Islamic State was undergone by this Western-led coalition. The Russians, when they moved into Syria, they concentrated their strikes on the opposition. And in Aleppo, there was no ISIS or Islamic State in sight, but they bombed Aleppo to ruins, pretending they were fighting terrorism. There was only one clear-cut instance when the Russians fought the so-called Islamic State. It's in the oasis of Palmyra. Palmyra is an oasis at the center of a big desert. How could the jihadis cross hundreds of kilometers of desert, take control of Palmyra without the Russians reacting only when they were really in Palmyra? And how can you defend Palmyra? It's an oasis in the desert. It's really easy to try and conquer it. So they conquered it. They said they had liberated Palmyra from terrorism. They made a big symphony concert in Palmyra with Putin intervening on video conference and presenting it worldwide as his contribution to the world-like and global war against terror. And then a few weeks after that, the terrorists took Palmyra again. That was like, you had the impression, if it was not so tragic, that you were watching a very strange and disturbing movie. And it's only the second time that eventually the Russians devoted enough energy to effectively liberate Palmyra from terrorists, because their priority was not the Islamic State. Their priority was the anti-Assad coalition. But despite that, if you listen to their discourse, they are fighting terrorism, 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 terrorism. First thing. Second thing, the killing of journalists. The killing of journalists has been systematic in Syria from day one. There was one instance in the city of Homs in February 2012, where two prominent reporters, the American Mary Colvin and the French Remy Ochlik, were targeted by a missile strike in a media center that was run by the opposition. There was no possibility of mistake. It was a media center. And there were many cases of Western journalists being killed or abducted because there were, priority strike for the Assad regime. So that led the Syrian opposition to train the so-called citizen journalists who risk their life to try and witness from the Syrian territory the war crimes, the atrocities, the bombing, the killing of civilians. They were also targeted. I have a friend, and it's quite symbolic. He was a photographer documenting the atrocities of the regime in Aleppo, and he lost one eye because of a sniper firing. But still, he kept on documenting. And fortunately now he's a refugee in France and is a great reporter. But this systematic targeting of journalism led to the fact that today practically nobody can access many parts of Syria. So the regime and Russia can pretend that their official truth is the only truth because there is no alternative witness to deny it. So it's a whole process of delegitimization. And the third and last dimension that I will elaborate a little bit on is the fake news industry. So contrary to the popular thinking, it was not Donald Trump who invented the systematic fake news. It's Vladimir Putin in Syria. And with support and contribution and cooperation of Bashar al-Assad. And it is a process of killing the victims twice, because not only the people are killed, and very often in atrocious conditions, but their very killing is denied. Or the responsibility of the Assad regime and the indirect responsibility of Russia in the killing is denied. So it's really some kind of torture. When I was approximately your age, I was representative of the International Federation of Human Rights in Lebanon during the civil war. And I made the first report about the missing people. And I testified at the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva in 1984. And I could see from then on that really the victims, they want justice in order to appease the torture that they feel through the loss, through what they have been through. And so it's not just, again, a collateral damage. The Putin's war machine, the Assad war machine, is trying to kill the victim twice, to make them transparent, to deny the legitimacy of their suffering, to delegitimize them. It's systematic, it's an industry. And again, one can use the Orwellian, George Orwell, 1984, this famous dystopic novel. Well, at that time it was dystopic. Today we see it's quite real when you have war is peace, peace is war, and one thing is meaning the contrary, and the propaganda is always hammering it day after day. Imagine that in Syria, the whole Russian campaign, military campaign, was waged under the motto of reconciliation, or conflict management or conflict resolution. They were bombing people pretending it was conflict resolution. They were inflicting conflict by, increasing the conflict condition. Right? But, this kind of system, by going forward, by saying the truth and lie are the same, so we have to believe the lie and the truth is not to be believed, is of course spreading the conspiracy theories. And those conspiracy theories are the best support of the Russian war machine in this endeavor. And so by changing the very meaning of the words, by emptying the concept of international law of any practical meaning, and in fact, as I mentioned during this presentation, by even turning them into the contrary. Imagine delivering shampoo to a starving neighborhood of Damascus under the pretense of allowing humanitarian aid. It's really sadistic, but it's not only sadistic, it's trying to change the very meaning of what is happening. They are not just rewriting history, they are rewriting the facts at the moment that the facts are happening, which is, from their point of view, the best way to ensure that their only vision of history will be valid. So this was done on a very systematic way in Syria, and this has been, as you know too well, replicated in Ukraine. So I will just comment, the famous, and also come back as a historian to the reality of the quote, Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Hitler and of the Nazi regime, and who has been, portrayed as, in fact, the inventor of modern propaganda techniques. He was, in 1941, he accused the British, because it's always like that, they accuse the others, it's always the other that is, but in fact, if you listen what they say about the other, you realize that they speak about themselves. So what did he say in 1941? He said, when one lies, one should lie big and stick to it. So that was the quote. Then it has been, disseminated in other way, but that was the quote. What is sure is that what we saw in Syria during so many years, what we saw in Ukraine during the past years, is that the bigger the lie, the stronger they will stick to it. And they will never back down. They will never say, oh, maybe something happened. Oh, no. The bigger the lie, the stronger their propaganda to support it. And for me, that was a way to present it too quickly, but the Syrian laboratory boils down to that in Syria, the victims have been deprived of their right to being victims. They have been denied even these rights. And they have been fighting for international justice, trying to document the crimes and trying to collect all the proofs. And slowly, through the so-called universal habilitation, trials are being held in Germany mainly to slowly bring justice to the Syrian victims. In Ukraine, fortunately, those lessons have been learned. And as you know better than me, practically from day one, proofs have been collected in Ukraine about all the crimes of the Putin's war machine. And already all this is being processed by legal experts in order one day, eventually, hopefully, to bring justice. But I wanted to end on this, if I might say, hopeful note that justice will be upheld here, but underlining the fact that in Syria, people are still waiting for this justice to prevail. And this was one of the tragic victories of the Putin's war machine in Syria, and one of the way to show that the Syrian laboratory was so crucial for Putin's war machine, not only to oppress the Syrian people until today, but also to project this terror out of Syria until Ukraine and Europe. So do you have a question on this last part, or generally comments, Platon?
I want to ask you about Turkey. They say that they take part in this war because their main aim is to fight against terror. I wanted to ask you about the role of Turkey in this war, and is the one aim they searching for?
You know, again, you have to see, you are 1 year, which is 1 year too much, into this invasion. The Syrians have been now nearly 12 years into this tragedy. So Turkey has changed position or has evolved. In the beginning, Turkey was pretty friendly to Bashar al-Assad, and so they could mediate with Bashar al-Assad. President Erdogan saw that, at least during the first months. Then he realized that Bashar al-Assad wanted to liquidate the opposition, period. So Turkey turned to NATO and asked for NATO for a no-fly zone in northern Syria. So one cannot rewrite history. When we see what happened during the past decade, maybe a no-fly zone at that time that would have been costly would have cost less than all the tragedy that happened ever since. So there was no no-fly zone, which meant that refugees started to come first to Turkey by the millions and then to Europe. So Turkey felt largely abandoned by NATO. So Erdogan turned to Putin, and he made a deal with Putin. Why did he make this deal with Putin? Because in their fight against Islamic State, the so-called Islamic States, the Americans, the French, and the British had decided to side with the Kurds, or not the Kurds in general, but a party that is separatist and that Turkey considered as a terrorist and as an internal threat for its own stability and sovereignty. So because of this, alienation from NATO or disappointment from NATO, and this partnership between the West and those Kurdish militias, you had a deal between Putin and Erdogan. And this deal was central in the fall of Aleppo. If Aleppo, if you remember, Aleppo, one half of Aleppo, eastern half of Aleppo, was controlled by the revolutionary forces for 4 years, more or less, from the summer of 2012 to the fall of 2016. It's because Turkey abandoned this revolutionary stronghold that the Russians and their allies could claim, quote unquote, victory in Aleppo, but victory among ruins. There was very little left in Aleppo. That's when Turkey joined a triangular process, that I will discuss in the next class with Russia and Iran about the so-called deconflicting zone, where Turkey was in this ambiguous partnership with Russia, sometimes cooperating with Russia, sometimes challenging Russia. And it has been that until today. Because now you have a lot of rumors that with the earthquake, nothing know what will come out of it, that President Erdogan from Turkey could reconcile with Bashar al-Assad because he would like to expel a significant amount of Syrian refugees before the presidential election of next spring. But now, the catastrophe is such that nobody is even thinking about it because we're counting the casualties by the thousands. And nobody is asking question online. Nobody is. Please feel free.
I have a question.
You
Okay, after the regimes will fall, we, under we, I mean international community, we will have to communicate with these people who supported Putin, who supported Assad in Syria, in Russia, and I want to ask you how we could affect their minds to make them see, to make them understand that they supported maybe evil in this pure form, and how to build process of communication between international community and these people.
That's a very crucial and strategic issue. In that case, I will speak about my feeling, my opinion. I think that the more you can try to make some kind of division between Putin or Assad and their so-called popular base, the better. But you have to understand that this base, most of them are more passive than active. They consider that Assad or Putin is a ruling power, and so it's better to be with the ruling powers than with the opposition. They prefer the status quo to any possibility of change. But it's very important, and I state it in general terms, to foster the communication towards these people, to try to have a regime, not to try to amalgamate them together, to try and prove that it's not true. Putin is not defending you. The contrary, is bringing your country to a dead end and eventually a catastrophe. Assad is not defending you. He destroyed the country. Syria has been brought back to decades earlier because of Assad refusing to make any significant concession. And I say it in a few sentences, but I'm convinced that a discourse should be built to bring at least a part of those people who are not, eternally linked to those regimes and who could be, I believe, reconciled to the idea of a regime change. Okay.
Merci.
Thank you. Okay. I think we came to the end of that class. So, dear Tatiana, should I give you the floor back?
Microphone, panie Tatiana.
Merci beaucoup Jean-Pierre. Il faut que nous commencions notre cours de l'anthropologie politique à 3 heures de l'après-midi. Donc, il reste quelques minutes encore pour nos étudiants de master. Je vais leur dire pour qu'ils рechangent l'adresse de Zoom. Ми починаємо через кілька хвилин курс першої лекції по політичній антропології, так що мої магістри, ви переключайтесь, будь ласка, і наступного тижня, la semaine prochaine, у вас буде можливість ще раз прийти на лекцію пана Філью. Ils vont venir dans une semaine à votre cours. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Pierre. On reste en contact, on reste en contact.
À
Merci.
vous, chère Tatiana.
Merci. Все, я вас чекаю, шановні, за декілька хвилин. Чекаю на вас. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Merci, Jean-Pierre. Merci.